So one thing we should keep in mind is that this essay is really an argument for the existence of God. Whether it's a good one or not is up to you to decide. So the argument, I suppose, in this section, the argument briefly stated is really an argument that the conclusion of which should be that God must exist. Um, but it follows from some premises about morality. So, given that morality is what it is, or there are certain truths about morality, about the nature of morality, one might say, the premises, then God most likely exists, I suppose, is the argument. But let's look at those premises. The first one, again, premise one, in every actual case, one has most reason to do what is morally required. He really wants to hold on to that. That is, he really believes that that's true, and he believes that that is actually a basic truth in our outlook on the world, that in every actual case, one has most reason to do what is morally required. So that if you're in a situation where you have to make choices and you know what the right thing to do is, that's the right choice, right? To do what is morally required. There may be other prudential reasons for doing something different than what is morally required, but what is morally required will always be the best case. You will have most reason to do that. He gives some, defense of that, but he basically says that that's just sort of built into our way of looking at the world. So that's the first premise, and he does want to hold on to that, right? That in every actual case, you have most reason to do what is morally required. That prudential, whatever other prudential reasons you have to do for something else will be weaker than the reason you have to do what is morally required. Now, the second premise is really the heart of the thing here, I suppose. Premise two, if there is no God and no life after death, then there are cases in which morality requires that one make a great sacrifice that confers relatively modest benefits or prevents relatively modest harms. And here's the case of Ms. Poor. Ms. Poor is a good person. Ms. Poor has lived many years in grinding poverty. She can't get ahead. She's got health problems. She's got all sorts of bad luck, and she has a chance to steal some money and get away with it and to solve all of her problems. And moreover, the money that she's stealing would really not harm anybody. I mean, to a very great extent, one might say, practically speaking. What does she say? She is also aware that the person who owns the money is very wealthy and will not be greatly harmed by the threat. She'll live in poverty for the rest of her life if she doesn't have it, so on and so forth, that it's in her long-term benefit to steal this money. And as he says, I believe that the Ms. Poor case offers intuitive support for premise two. That is, sometimes in order to do the right thing, we have to make really, really big sacrifices for the sake of very small benefits or the avoidance of very small harms. That's premise two, that if there is no God, if there's no afterlife, if we lived in the naturalistic world that the scientific worldview says, and there are cases in which morality requires, in which it's our duty to do things that would entail great sacrifices and confer relatively modest benefits. Okay, that's the second premise. And then the third premise at the bottom of the page here, on 380, obviously. If in a given case, one must make a great sacrifice, in order to do what is morally required, but the sacrifice confers relatively modest benefits or prevents relatively modest harms, then one does not have most reason to do what is morally required. Okay. Now, as I said before, obviously this contradicts the first principle. That is, yeah. So then, what does he make of this? If you look on the second column here, what he believes is that this is the basis for an argument for God's existence and for the existence of an afterlife. Premise one, in every actual case, one has most reason to do what is morally required. Premise two, if there is no God and no life after death, then there are cases in which morality requires that one make a great sacrifice that confers relatively modest benefits or prevents relatively modest harms. Premise three, if in a given case one must make a great sacrifice in order to do what is morally required, but the sacrifice confers relatively modest benefits or prevents relatively modest harms, then one does not have the most reason to do what is morally required. Premises 2 and 3 imply the following conclusion. If there is no God and no life after death, then in some cases one does not have the most reason to do what is morally required. That is, if there's no eternal reward, if there's no God to whom you are personally responsible and who you would never want to alienate, as he says, then go ahead. Ms. Poor should go ahead and steal that money. For sure, she has most reason to steal the money. If there is a God, and there's something like punishment or reward in an afterlife, or there's just a God that you have duties to that are absolute, then she shouldn't steal the money, right? So what he's doing is he's holding on to premise one here, right? He's saying that premise one is basic. We all believe premise one. Premise one is true. So anything like premise three must be false, right? That is, there can't be circumstances in which it's not the right. We don't have the strongest reason to do what is moral. But the only way to save premise one and avoid premise three is to deny premise two. That is to say that there is a God, and if there is a God and there is an afterlife, then there are no cases in which it's morally required that one make a great sacrifice that confers relatively modest benefits. We still may have to make great sacrifices, but they will not confer relatively modest benefits, because the benefit of doing what God wants you to do, the benefit of not alienating yourself from God, is a humongous benefit, right? Is a tremendous, humongous. I said humongous. Is a tremendous benefit, is an incalculably important benefit. So the only way to save premise one is to say that there are no situations in which there are any other prudential reasons that may outweigh the moral reasons we have for doing things, because there is never a situation in which the sacrifice we make has only relatively modest benefits. So four, if there is no God and no life after death, then in some cases one does not have reason to do what is morally required. And one, in every actual case, one has most reason to do what is morally required. What follows from that? Well, that atheism is false, that the statements here, 5, there is no God and no life after death, is false. That is, either God exists or there is life after death, right? So if we hold on to 1 and we combine it with 4, then that is actually the argument for the existence of God. That is, if you always have most reason to do what is morally required, but if there is no God and no life after death, then in some cases one does not have most reason to do what is morally required, then there must be a God. There must be a life after death. It's an interesting argument. I mean, you have to read it over and think about it, think about what he's saying. But it definitely makes sense. Now, whether it's a good argument, I don't know. Of course, it all depends on holding on to premise one, that in every actual case, one has most reason to do what is morally required. And as he looks at objections, which we'll do in the next video, I would say that that's the point that the argument might be at its weakest.